My name is Mark McConnaughay. When I knew I was gay, well, I didn't have a word like gay, but I knew I was different than the other kids probably as far back as 8 or 9 years old. I just didn't seem to feel the same way the other kids did. You know, just that sense of being different. Even before there was any talk about same or opposite sex attraction. And then I was raised in a very conservative Midwestern Christian home, and so I knew certain things were right or wrong, even though if I didn't understand what the wrong was. And I remember when I started to notice that I was more attracted to boys than girls, I thought, well, whatever it is, it must be a phase, because this is considered a sin, and I'm a good little Christian boy, so this can't be me. And I remember in 8th grade, in Mrs. Kleehouse's English class, I was at that point dating a girl, or going out, or whatever we called it back then, that was a year younger than me. And at some point, this very good-looking, athletic Filipino boy named Riz Espinelli came up from behind me and threw his hands around me into like a bear hold. And my heart just about leaped out of my chest. And he let go of me and was like, ah, ha, 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 ha. And I stood there and I realized, well, I can't pretend. If I had that kind of reaction to that, I know that there's no pretending anymore. When I came out, I was about 23 years old. I had gone to Scotland to buy my first set of official bagpipes, because I was practicing in a pipe band in New York City. And I was playing on a bad set of pipes made in Pakistan, and my teacher said I needed better pipes. So I went over to Scotland and I met my first boyfriend at a bar there near my bed and breakfast. And we were together for 3 years. And he came to stay with me on a traveler's visa for 3 months in New York over the Easter holiday. And he was sitting in my living room, and I went off to church like a good little Christian boy, still not sure which way I was going to go with this. And while I was at church, my father called my apartment. John answered the phone, and my father screamed into the phone, "He is risen! He is risen indeed!" And poor John was so flustered by that, he must have smoked through a pack of cigarettes before I got home from church. And he would not answer the phone again for as long as we were together without me first calling and talking into the answering machine saying, "It's me, pick up the phone." And I realized I was doing a disservice to him and to my family by not explaining to them what was going on. So I flew home and we went to a restaurant near the airport, and I sat there and I just painfully came out to them. And my mother cried. And she said, "I wish we had known, we could have helped you." But I look back on that, and the only thing I could think they would have done to help me was to have probably put me into some sort of conversion therapy program. And I don't know if I would have understood enough about what that was to have resisted it. So I think I made the right decision to wait until I was on my own and outside of their full control. But what's sad is that was 30 years ago. And today, they still aren't as completely comfortable with it as I'd like them to be. They've been nice to my partners over time, but they still live in a little bubble where the church isn't completely clear on the teaching. And I think to this day, they still really wish that it wasn't the case. I think as I've watched how their minds have become polluted by conservative politics and their devotion to Fox News over the years, I've realized that there's no changing their minds at this point. And I think I've come to the conclusion that too much of their worldview and the way that they live their lives would be at risk if they were to start questioning one thing. The whole ball of yarn would come unraveled. And I think at this point they would just as soon keep the peace and just exit without having to think too hard about anything. Well, I came to San Francisco. It was the third time that my Scottish partner, John, had come to live with me. I took a job in San Francisco, knew nothing about it. I just knew that, you had the most crooked street there. And I think I might have known there were a lot of gays there, but it wasn't really in my mind. And we ended up renting a small one-bedroom apartment on 25th and Castro in Noe Valley. And I worked downtown, and we didn't have a car, and we would walk up over the hill from Noe Valley into the Castro because that's where the majority of the restaurants were, and we were enjoying exploring the city. But especially when we were down in the Castro, we could feel like this kind of weird sadness over the area, and I could never figure out what it was until one time we were at an estate sale buying furniture, because when I moved to San Francisco, I really didn't have much of anything. And I said something about like, oh, I really like this chair. Did someone die? And he says, yeah, oh, he just passed away from AIDS. And then it hit me. I realized I would imagine San Francisco might have been affected by that. Again, just not understanding. And well, I think that shook me enough where I started to realize that I didn't really know my own history as a gay man. And so I started going to bookstores and picking up books and really asking more questions and making more friends. And when I look back on that, to not know what I had just landed in the midst of in 1993 and what was going on, I can't believe my worries about silly little problems like, oh, John's spending too much money on groceries at the grocery store, and are we going to be able to make it on my salary and stuff like that, when people were basically dying around us. And the only time I found out about that was when I was actually picking through the belongings, figuring out what to buy, and realized what was going on. So because of the fact that there was no internet as I was growing up, and the fact that you had to go out and find information, I find it so amazing how many of the young people today don't know what happened, don't know how many people fought. Like, as an example, at Stonewall, I lived about a block and a half away from the Stonewall Inn when I lived in New York City. And I started to learn like how many people I owe the rights to that I was experiencing. And I'll give you an example. In '93, when we moved to San Francisco, I was still very shy about my sexuality. And when John and I walked into the video store across the street from our apartment, and I asked to join, and they said, "And what's your partner's name?" I'd never been asked that before, and the fact that the person didn't flinch or didn't act strange about it, I remember my ears getting really red and realizing like, oh my gosh, I never dreamed of what it would be to be acknowledged as a normal person. And I think that feeling that I had in that moment, unfortunately, too many of the young people today, because they grew up seeing it on television and seeing icons like, Ellen DeGeneres is an example. I mean, there was nobody out back then. My role models were Jack Tripper from Three's Company, which I wasn't even allowed to watch once my parents understood how racy it was. I didn't know anything. That information's there now, but I feel like so many of the young people today just take for granted that we're moving on from there. But I still travel enough in this country that I know there's plenty of places like where my parents exist that still don't treat us fairly. Well, I remember when the gay marriage became an issue. And I guess maybe I still had some self-loathing. I didn't want anything to do with gay marriage. I simply just wanted to be left alone. I didn't want to be bullied. I didn't want to be teased anymore. I simply wanted to be left alone, and I didn't want any lightning rod issues that I knew would make other people try to hate us. And I felt that's what would happen with gay marriage. And I feel like now the right has now chosen trans rights because that's something that they feel they can make people squeamish about. And it always seems like they target the most marginalized. And so in a way, I think we really have to get behind and support those most marginalized parts of the community. I remember when the lesbians didn't like how much the gays were getting attention. So as much as I'm sure that trans people probably felt the way I did back then of, I don't necessarily need rights, I just need you to leave me alone and keep me safe. But if we're going to make an issue out of their rights, then we need to have that fight. Even such things as, I'm dating a young, very young black man now who feels very comfortable and most self-expressed wearing makeup. And I went through issues like, how can I be dating somebody with makeup on? And now as I've gotten to know him, I realized, well, this is an extension of who he sees himself as a person. But I also know, and we've talked about it, he opens himself up to more potential for harm. That he's not trying to blend in or disappear the way I thought was the best way to be gay when I was his age. And I think that, if anything, we need to take on and fight for the rights of the most outlandish and fabulous of our community, whether they be trans or gay or lesbian or just questioning or queer. Let people stop holding people into gender normative roles, requiring that they conform and blend in. In college, I worked in a small town in Iowa. And I remember walking one night outside of my little apartment with a couple of other college students and looking up into the heavens and saying, there's only two things I want. I want to earn my own money, and I want to know what it is to feel loved. Well, I learned how to earn my own money, and I learned how to feel loved, to be proud of the person that loved me. And for many years after that, I fought shame for how I was disappointing my family, how I thought for a time that I was disappointing my God. And I've lived twice as long since then. And I've realized that all the shame that was buried inside of me, I still keep peeling away layers of that, like layers of an onion. Don't let what other people tell you about who you are affect how you know yourself to be inside. I listened and took those messages in for many, many years. And I find myself still to this day casting off images of what I thought I was supposed to be and trying to find what I actually was. And while my life might have been easier because I was trying to blend in, I find myself admiring and being more proud of those who simply could not fit in. And I think that they're actually better off in the long run because they own who they are and they don't have to spend so long to try to figure out who they really are because they've always known. I was still struggling to find my own identity well into my 30s. If you can find who you are and live as that person, as soon as you find that, don't let anybody tell you that you're wrong.